Welcome, everybody, to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you, Abdaljawad and Lara, as we reflect and discuss. Today, Tufan Al-Aqsa is the second anniversary of, what commonly is referred to as October 7th now. And obviously, I couldn't think of two people that I would rather, have a discussion with today. I've obviously talked to both of you a tremendous amount in the last couple of years. And I'm really, happy, excited that I get to have both of you in conversation, that all three of us kind of were, um, without much planning, kind of in synchronized in that we wanted to have a discussion today. And so, I asked both of you if you would, want to talk with each other, and you both were, excited about that opportunity. So, for one, I'm really excited, honored always to have both of you, but excited to have you both in conversation publicly for the first time, even though you both obviously follow each other's work and are admirers of each other's political thought and all of that. So, folks, if you're watching, of course, like, share, subscribe. I put a link in the show description to the Samir Project. I encourage people to continue to support Palestinians in Gaza in whatever ways you can, to connect with them, to give, to help them maintain their dignity as they continue to resist in all kinds of basic everyday ways, right? Um, and there's a lot to reflect upon today. I don't think that any of us had in our mind the morning of October 7th, 2023, when we woke up and saw the images of, people in Gaza breaking down literally the walls, right, of this concentration camp, and, you know, attacking soldiers, right, and this kind of very heroic, visual array, right? Which I do encourage people. Um, Lara mentioned as we before we started, like, do you think we could show pictures of this? And I think this is something we'll talk about today too, is like, what are we allowed to show and say, right? And how all of those things also have been, that whatever we felt, right? And I know for different people it's going to be different things, but whatever we felt on October 7th, that there's been a long campaign now over the last 2 years that's still ongoing. There's new shows coming out today to demonize it and present it in a certain light and all of that, that those feelings have been suppressed in an organized fashion, and the thoughts associated with them. And by that I mean, for many of us it was an anti-colonial moment, it was a liberatory moment, very much so. Maybe for most of us, or all of us, I don't know, it might be the most kind of liberatory moment or feeling that we've felt in our entire lives in some way for that day. And that that is one of the things, obviously, that has been targeted, right? Obviously we could talk about, and we'll talk about, the genocide, but also the way that alongside the genocide has been a campaign to kind of, you know restructure our interiorities in a certain way, or our, to be less academic, maybe, just our minds and our hearts, and how we think and feel about something like October 7th. And so I'll just start there. The images, I forgot to finish that thought. I included a link from Instagram that shows in the show description some images of hang gliders, of fences coming down, of beautiful photography, right, of that day, because I think that there's a curated set of images that are now more dominant about the way that are supposed to restructure or present a certain feeling about how we're supposed to feel about that day. And so I just want to start there. And Abdul Jawad, I would love for you to kind of lead us off. And yeah.
Well, thanks, Jared. And yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm really glad to be with Lara. specifically. So, and honored as well to share this stage with her. Having said that, I mean, I think today somebody who's very close to my heart told me that they both hate and love this day, October 7th. And it seems that that kind of like confliction exists within each of us, at least in Palestine, but also in Lebanon and other places across the region, where both this moment of realizing some sort of potential for liberation in the concrete is also followed with this, like, you know, nightmare. And in the beginning, the first article I wrote on October 7th was in Arabic, and it said this is a moment caught in air, and it both kind of conjures the dream and the nightmare as well. And I think it still does in many ways conjure both the dream and the nightmare, although we've been living in the nightmare in a way where hope betrays us daily. So there are all of those things. There's a lot of events that happened in the past 2 years, and they continue. And I mean, it's also kind of weird. I mean, just to situate this, that we're kind of like commemorating an event that actually has not really ended, as if, you know, it's some marker of something. Although it is a marker, meaning that there's a before and after October 7th for everybody here as well, listening. Their life was, you know, radically shifted, changed. You know, perhaps they questioned anchors in the life. Perhaps they got introduced to Palestine. Perhaps they renewed their commitment to this cause. So there's all of these different elements that, you know, coexist with this moment. But at the same time, I think that, you know, this duality of love and hate kind of coexists, and even in political discourse in Palestine, and perhaps in the region more broadly, there's also that element of expression around it. You know, of course, some of it is manufactured. It's part of the psychological warfare against our minds and consciousness, but some of it also, you know, erupts from within. Should we regret this moment or not? Should we have not done it at all or not? Should we have not breached the walls that surrounded and enveloped the Gaza Strip or not? So all of these, you know, come through as that these type of radical ruptures actually do, which is they bring to the fore, you know, a mix and a whirlwind of emotions. And we cannot really situate ourselves concretely, and we live in this kind of zone of uncertainty and disorientation that continues with us, and it still continues to this date. Having said that, I mean, I think that one of the things that I want to highlight is actually something that, you know, showed up today. Around 5 a.m., the Israeli army entered, you know, close by to where I live, and I think they were trying to rehearse some sort of, you know, what they call make your presence felt type of operation. And it was kind of ridiculous. It actually looked like something from Ilyas Slimani's movie. Ilyas Sliman is like a Palestinian director who does this kind of dark, humoric takes on the occupation and narrates, you know, the Palestinian story through film. Because they stayed for hours, just, you know, going from one point to another, arresting young men, putting them in a school, making them making them clear the walls from any slogans, and at the same time, just, you know, continuing this kind of up and down the hill near my house. I don't know if they even left. I haven't really followed through. But I think one of the running jokes today, at least for Palestinians in the West Bank, has been, if the Israelis ask you on checkpoints or soldiers ask you what the date is, that you shouldn't tell them the date, that you should, you know, evade saying that it's October 7th. And it's the date that we should not name, no? Because if you say October 7th, apparently the soldiers will, you know, put you in waiting more, or even beat you, or perhaps even like wound you, whatever, you know. So there's that fear of actually uttering that word October 7th. And there's something here very productive in terms of how, despite the Israeli army and Israel more broadly wanting us to forget and perhaps renounce that date, that by their very actions, they actually remind us of it. So this is one element of this irony that is, you know, existing at this current moment. But the other one is, I think, more important, is that they're forcing us to remember to forget this date. And this kind of relationship between remembering and forgetting is quite important because it harkens also to something that I think is very central to October 7th itself, more broadly. The idea of a fugitive community, of armed fighters that have created an underground, that are also in many ways are people who live among us, but we need to also, as those who live in the social time, the time where we're visible, actually remember to forget, because we need to protect their very existence. We need to ensure that they are not found out. It has a long history in Palestinian history, this idea of the hunted, the pursued one by the Israeli intelligence, the one who's in hiding or in disappearance. And that kind of relationship between disappearance from the visual field and its relationship to the colonial infrastructure more broadly, where everything needs to be rendered actually visible. So the intelligence officer knows everything about everything that he needs to know to defeat us and continue this cycle of defeat and its perpetuation through time. So there's something quite also important about this forgetting or remembering to forget, because it actually, I think it's an intense form of remembering, and it's even more intense than remembering constantly. So in many ways, I think that type of relationship of having a loved one join the resistance, or going underground, or even building the architecture of disappearance, things like tunnels, or hiding in caves, or even if they're hiding in plain sight, within the social time. Even in the West Bank, you have these type of phenomena where people hide in apartments, or try to evade the security officer, because it harkens towards also something else that I think is central, is that in this time of hiding, in this time of disappearing, in this architecture of the underground, potentiality exists. And this is scary for the colonial order, but it's also the one thing that actually sustains our capacity to resist through time, is this ability to actually become absent rather than present, and through being absent also terrify the colonial order by just merely being absent. This is important. You don't have to even do anything. Just being not in this plane of visibility creates this kind of paranoid reaction on the part of the colonial order itself, that wants to render everything visible, everything knowable, everything transparent. This is one of the things, but it's also, you can generalize this to the whole globe, because this is the type of world we live in, where technology, social media, and our relationship that is mediated through these kind of constant surveillance is also trying to render us quite transparent and visible to these billionaire capitalist class that is trying to shape and reshape the world, and are actually very much involved also in the destruction of Gaza, and also conceiving of the plans of what comes after Gaza, with the Riviera and other plans that are being put in play. So there's this kind of, I think, important element of forgetting or remembering to forget that existed this moment. And of course, it turned into a joke, and people are in many ways in this joke not mentioning October 7th yet, all the time mentioning it. That's a thing that is happening as a moment that both, I think, for us is painful. It's full of loss, because as I said quite a lot here, the reality of living under this terror regime makes you understand that resistance is a wager. It's not something that is guaranteed. It's without guarantees. It gives you a chance to liberate yourself. It doesn't mean that you'll liberate yourself. And at the same time, surrender is also full of loss, because eventually this colonial order wants to evict you. This is at least one element, I think, of how we can mediate on this moment and its actual manufacturing. This relationship between those who hide, those who remain in the shadows, those who create and sustain the possibility and the capacity to resist through maintaining their also presence as absentees, and build the infrastructure and architecture that is necessary for that. There's more to say, but I don't want to talk too much, so I'll give you Jared the floor.
Yeah, no, we'll get to lots of it, so appreciate it. Thank you for starting us off. Yeah, Lara, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I want to echo what Abdaljawad said. It feels like such an honor to be in conversation with you, and I consider you Rafiq Ukhay, and it feels like, you know, Jay also making the space. Like, I think I can't underscore this enough, right? That your channel, the way that your generosity, the way that you've brought us on here to be able to make meaning out of this. This is 2 years later, and I think these public facing conversations, and I certainly have followed every conversation you two have had, um, is an intervention in and of itself. And Abdaljawad and myself being in conversation together feels like an important piece of like defiance as Lebanese and Palestinian under the same condition, right? And that's the piece of it, right? That like this atomization that this condition creates, where we're meant to think that somehow our histories aren't intertwined with each other, not just as a force of the occupation and the brutal regime that is shoved down our throats, but also as a long history that predates that, of resistance and connection between Palestine and Lebanon. And that feels really important in this moment when we're thinking about, if we're marking anything, when we're thinking about it, what does it mean to also mark that we're kind of already living in the world that we're trying to build and push past this, and a revival or a reclamation, right? It's not even a revival, it's a reclamation. If we're thinking about things going underground, right? We can think about actual literal people going underground, but what does it mean also for our movements, for our struggles, for our resistance, for the ways that our shared histories have been sort of dislodged and gone underground for so long. And now we see a new moment, right? That is a reclamation of that past. It's not even having to like reinvent. Now, there are different conditions. I think Amjad was saying that there are different conditions we're under. There is a level of surveillance that we've never seen before. There's a machinery of war that we have to contend with that is new, right? So saying, yes, this is a condition that has always been here is really important in terms of an analytic or a logic, so that we don't feel disoriented by it. So we're not just like, oh, this is a new thing we're learning. One of the things we know from the histories of both our countries is that this is a logic that goes far back. We understand that it repeats itself, and yet the new machinery with which it's repeating, the global stage on which it's happening, the ferocity, the violence, the lack of any red lines in general, even in, in sort of in lip service, is also important when we're thinking about this. But I'm also thinking about where Abdaljawad just sort of put us immediately, is this idea of what Tufan Al-Aqsa for me did immediately. And I was in Doha, which I'm so grateful I was in the Arab world, not only because it was in real time and I didn't have to wake up, so many hours later, but also because there was a way in which it was planted in a different type of reality. And just sort of having conversations with comrades in, Turtle Island about like how immediately distorted it was, like warped into a separate universe in terms of what was happening, how it was happening, the imagery that was being shown. The machine was in high gear immediately. And a reminder to folks that that machine doesn't, kick into high gear if the infrastructure is not there for it to happen. So this is a long-term plan that kicks into high gear when it needs to. But what it did was disrupt at a level of disruption that was needed, that kind of cuts through the things that might have felt inevitable in that moment. And we have a disruption literally, materially, when we see those images. And I do really strongly encourage folks to look at this. Even I, in looking at them again, was like shocked how I had forgotten some of it, of what it means to see a fence broken and people who have been behind a fence for 17 plus years on the other side, not even that far from it, by the way, right? To just kind of sit with what that means, which brings to question Abduljawad's idea that the contradictions couldn't hold themselves anymore. I think we're in that world, the world where the contradictions are falling in on themselves, where they are clear to so many of us, where they keep sort of making themselves known. And that sustaining pressure is what's now. That sustaining pressure doesn't come without wear and tear, doesn't come without grief, doesn't come without continuous sort of rethinking and reworking. But to continue keeping those contradictions at the fore, I think, is why we have conversations like this. What does it mean to not allow the pressure to cede? What does it mean to continuously push against the seams so that it cannot recalibrate itself? I think this is part of what's happening with the Zionist entity and project in general, is that, yes, they have the force of the superpowers of the world behind them, and also the amount of pressure across the board, and we can talk about what that looks like in its different instantiations, also is not allowing the recalibration in the way that they imagine, that only a settler colony and their violent psyche could imagine a returning back to quote unquote normal after a moment like that, right? Their lack of imagination and creativity for a different world, because it's locked into an ideology of elimination and erasure, is being borne out now. This is what we're seeing, right? Whereas on the flip side, I think we're seeing, whether it's through the underground or through the spectrum of visibility, invisibility, and the play that's involved with that, right? Is that people of the land and sort of having to be forced to be resourceful in ways that settlers and violent oppressors can't imagine, right? I think this is what we're seeing. But I also want to say that Abdaljawad said something really important, and I hear this in Lebanon all the time too, of course, right? About, should we have done it? Like, was it worth it? All these sort of ways of thinking. I don't want to blame people for going there, people on the ground who have to consider these impossible choices. What I want to do is highlight the cruelty of that thought. The fact that someone has to guide themselves or entertain that thought in and of itself shows us the abject cruelty that's at the heart of having somebody have to consider that when the question of their liberation, their dignity, and their right to self-determination is at hand. And that brings us into one of the things Jay and I have talked a lot about, the psychic inversions that work seamlessly and make themselves as mainstays. Because even the question, even if we're thinking, I'm not even just saying psychically or affectively, I'm thinking just analytically, that the second you ask the question, should we have, it means there's a condition that precedes that question. And yet somehow we're supposed to go forward with that question as though it has merit on its own, disconnected from the condition that would create that thinking to begin with, right? That anybody who's in a position to say, was this worth it, means they are living under a condition that brought to task, right, and brought to the surface a fundamental question of their own sort of survival, and having to say, this is the moment that we take up, this is the moment we make that wager, as Abdaljawad said. This is the moment that wager is no longer a passive one, right? In Doha, I was, and a shout out to all my students from Gaza and from Palestine, who I was lucky enough to be in classrooms with, who right afterwards, sort of in conversation and sort of making meaning of this, just the most simple things. And I've said this before, but I just want to uplift their voices again, of like, the price was already being paid. And maybe in ways that were palatable to other people or made it easier for people to think about. But for people in Gaza or in other places, just like in Jnub Lebanon or anywhere else that gets the brunt of this violent death machine, that price was already paid in other ways. And what does it mean to get to the moment where it's like the eruption of this, the contradiction in that moment also can't hold itself? And so it's not even a question of, do we go forward or not? It's, this wager feels like the only possibility, the only logical extension of what needs to happen to talk about laying bare the what's underneath that, rather than the violence of having people be tasked with holding that alone, and the rest of us sort of sympathizing, of course, being part of the liberation struggle. But what are the demands that are now made of us 2 years later, certainly immediately after? There's something about also including us and bringing us into that process, saying, okay, the wager is ours, yes, and certainly on the ground, and now this is what it means to fight for the world that you say you are committed to on a global scale. And that's, I think, where I'm sitting on today, about the relational pull, the invitation in, the commitments, the political commitments, certainly for myself, but also for others, about what does this moment demand of us? And if it is about laying bare contradictions and constantly doing that, what does that mean for our struggle in this moment, but also what comes after?
Yeah. And what is the when have all the contradictions been laid bare, right? And and what do you do at that point, right? So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that both of you said that that resonated, that are on my mind as well. It's interesting, Abdaljawad, too, that you brought up this notion of remembering to forget or forgetting to remember, right? This contradiction. It's very interesting, actually. And I'll just make a comment, because really what I want you to do, Abdul Jawad, is just to keep going with, whatever else that you had, that you wanted to offer. But so you don't feel a need to respond to what I'm about to say. But I had a conversation last week that'll come out later this week with a minister, and we were talking about the Deuteronomic history, and the Amalek story and all of this. And it also contains this contradiction, because in the biblical, in the Old Testament, right, uh the commandment is to blot out from history Amalek, but then constantly people are told to remember Amalek. Right. And so what does that mean? Right. I mean, this is also the kind of impossibility. And it actually shows, I think, very much this. I mean, one, it's a kind of counterinsurgent story that is told, right? Of if someone transgresses your world, right, then you have to totally destroy them, destroy their all their means of life and subsistence. This is a biblical story. It's one, for people who don't know what I'm referencing, this is also something that Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich, et cetera, that they reference, right? So you have to do all of that, but then you also have to, and you're told that these people must be blotted out, right? That their history must be erased. But then you have to remember that, right? And so in that, you're not actually erasing their history. And I think it's something there of also the impossibility of the total foreclosure of different alternatives, right? Revolutionary alternatives, et cetera, right? Is that even in these attempts to, totally, most brutally crush the idea of, for lack of a better term, the Palestinian question, right? The Palestinian self-determination, the process of, Palestinians determining for themselves the world that they want to be a part of, it, which is obviously a world that we also all, regardless of where we are in the world, want to see and want to live in, right? And it is in a certain way irrepressible, even as there are these attempts to destroy historical archives and all of that depth of seeking to blot out. So that just resonated to me, Abdul Jawad, with also this way in which, with October 7th, and this is it's a, we could talk about 9/11 in this way as well, although I don't necessarily want to make that comparison, but just the way that we're encouraged to remember and also forget. And the I guess part of it is that you're never allowed to think about what led up to it, right? What you were also saying, Lara, which is that at what point do unlivable conditions actually become totally unlivable to the extent that people have to resist them by force, right? And that whole question has to be kind of erased as you're also remembering the thing that happened because of that very question, right? So, yeah, Abdul Jawad, again, I didn't mean to cut in because I know you have more that you want to offer.
I mean, I might not have anything to offer, Jared. Like, don't assume. No, I'm just joking. But no, my own. No, I mean, I think this. So I was speaking about this kind of. I mean, it's very. I mean, while you were speaking, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of. There's a lot of resonance between what I was trying to say and the story of the Amalek, for instance, as you laid it out. But I think this is also something that about the conditions here, because I mean, as I wrote you in the email, I thought one entryway to also like thinking of October 7th is this moment of impossibility, or this condition, not moment, of impossibility, more broadly, that Palestinians live under. And here, impossibility, I'm not really speaking about, for instance, like philosophical riddles like a square circle, or I don't know, a married bachelor. I'm not talking about these type of logical textbook problems that mathematicians like to place, or philosophical, although there might be some resonance there. But I think impossibility here is a paradigm, even in things that I've also articulated before. For instance, can the Palestinian mourn, and mourning being an impossible condition, for instance. Or it's also a way of like really naming the structure under which we live. How do we normalize things that shouldn't be normalized? How we archive things that should be ejected? How we treat each other in this domain under this terror regime that we live under, as Palestinians under the Israeli boots. How we have to also like be aware of what triggers them, like today coming in and making their presence felt, and walking through the city and arresting men, and and all of this type of absurd scenes. And of course that absurdity extends even to the globe, when you see, for instance, Zionists claiming to be insecure in college campuses, or the British government cracking down on Palestine action and calling it, or rendering it, a terrorist group, and arresting blind and people who have disabilities on the street, holding these signs that say, I'm against genocide, I support Palestine action. So the absurdity extends everywhere. I mean, it's in how Trump also produces this videos. But so the impossible, at least, is a contradiction that lives with us all the time. And it's a lived tension of something the world insists cannot be, which is Palestine's liberation, no? And for Palestinians to actually have some sort of justice. I mean, of course, justice is impossible in its absolute total sense. It's always deferred, but to have some sort of I don't know, elevation of conditions, a way forward that does not is not based on this wedding of capitalism, technology, surveillance, colonialism, and all different things that come with it as the Palestinian condition, but also liberation, not only for the Palestinians, because I think here when I say Palestinians, I don't mean the Palestinians only within Palestine, but I name, as Lara was mentioning, the wider region, because even though places like Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt or other countries across the region might look independent, but in many ways their social rhythms, their political terrains are defined by the existence of this state that is built on this kind of exclusivist, ethno-nationalist domain, and is built also on this military supremacy, etc. And of course, liberating Palestine means also something for the whole region. Perhaps we won't be Lebanese and Palestinians anymore. I don't know. But the thing I'm trying to like force at least into view is that if we have that impossible condition, then also October 7th to me was an impossible moment. An impossible moment in the sense that for us to see these scenes, for us to see actually the breach, for us to surprise the Israeli military and intelligence, to see the Israelis in this moment of fragility and vulnerability that has opened this hole in their very existence and mode of relating to their own selves, that continues to this day, despite everything they do. And they continue to this day because they came in the morning to Ramallah, that is like, the most bourgeois, non-resistant city in Palestine. Let's put it that way. Although that's a bit of a bad reputation that I'm perpetuating, because it does have much resistance, specifically in not in Ramallah city itself, but at least in the villages and camps that surround Ramallah. But coming into the main city and acting this action, it tells us something about the nature and the character of this fragile, sensitive, easily triggered enemy that we have, of course, with a lot of weapons. This is the contradiction we have to live under as well, is that they're on one sense very powerful, but yet easily triggered. And always the question comes to my mind, and I wrote it in one piece of mine, what's wrong with them? Like, what are they doing? Like that's one of the things that there is logics to everything they do, of course, but there's also something also absurd in what they attempt to perpetuate. So at least for me, impossibility here is not static, because that was an impossible operation to pull off. It's like an impossible operation that made liberation look possible. And that will not be really forgotten, despite everything that happened. Yes, we might, end up with a big catastrophe that is more than even the catastrophe that we're already facing. And I already disentangled this idea of catastrophe and defeat from each other as much as possible, because some people kind of mesh them together. I think that we should always be aware of that, mingling of these two concepts together. But at the same time, I think that we must, at least to understand October 7, we must follow this kind of impossible as it travels from resistance to genocide, to disappearance, to imagination as well. And I think October 7th opened that imagination. Whatever happens in the future, there is that lesson that we might take from it, which is they're defeatable. And I don't think that a lesson is easy to erase, despite everything that has happened since, despite their transgressions of every rule, norm, despite their attempt to remake the world in an image that, is more techno-fascist. It's about, killing without any kind of consequences, destroying wholesale villages in southern Lebanon, and of course in Lebanon at large, destroying Gaza and destroying its built environment, and trying to, of course, ethnically cleanse and kill its people. Despite all of that, and despite the attempt to normalize through this transgression and breaking the rules, that attempts eventually to actually create new rules. So it's like rule breaking and rule making at the same time. I think that lesson will not be easily, at least, forgotten, even if we are forced to remember to forget it at times, so that they don't get really triggered. So that's part of the impossibility that we can speak about, at least in this register. That's what I wanted to say specifically on that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Lara, I want to give you a chance to respond as well, because I'm sure you have thoughts.
I do. How did you know? No. This is a good thing about being with a fellow comrade who's like, I got the email and from Abdaljawad, and I was just like, yeah, we're going there. We're gonna be like commuting between the sort of material and thinking on a more analytic and philosophical, because there is all those pieces are a part of this. And I think this is the impossible. Breaching the impossibility means also, for me, unlocking fixedness. I think if I'm going to sort of stay in my lane psychically and affectively, the point of oppressive systems and these larger structures that circumscribe our life and sort of orient us in particular ways are also meant to dictate and fix, right? And this is like a very Fanonian fixedness, fix the very parameters of existence, of possibilities, of what we imagine might come or not come. Because it's not enough just to dictate and control our present day life, right? There's a way, I mean, and Fanon goes into this very much, and it's not just him, but many people. It's just sort of like reach into your past, reconfigure it. Then this becomes like, of course, right? There's no such thing as this, or a total erasure of your past, but also reach into the future and make sure that you are thinking, you are constantly locked into this referential point of the colonizer, settler, oppressor, where the only reference point you have is the imagination or the surety of a settler future. That settlers will always have futures that are predicated on the current moment and the conditions that they're building so that their futures are secure, right? I think what October 7th does with these ongoing conversations, what unlocking something is like the surety of our liberation. It's not about being sure about what that looks like. I think this is maybe the collapse, Abdaljawad, that you were talking about, of like defeatism and catastrophe and all of that, is that I think sometimes there is a invitation or a conscription, a seduction psychologically to think that somehow this moment then dictates the surety of what that will look like. And I think if anything else, what we see on October 7th is an opening up of possibilities away from foreclosures. We can think literally foreclosures. If you're breaking out of a prison, you're breaking out of a foreclosure that, by the way, is not there haphazardly. It's meant to make you believe with every iota of your being that there is no breaching this. That's the point, right? It locks you in and fixes you in place. And then your entire world is oriented around that reference point. So breaking that materially means also going beyond a foreclosure. But I've also been just interested in the ways in which these moments alchemize, right? They transmute literal material. Yes, it's materiality, like a wall turns into a portal. We've talked about this before, but then what does that actually mean for us to then, if it's supposed to dictate past, present, future, what does it mean for us then? Also, the invitation is that possibility is there for us too, right? To rework and reimagine and reenact, and to understand that if what Abdaljawad is saying, if that was an impossible moment that made liberation possible, right? I think those were the exact words you said, but I'm paraphrasing if not. Is what does it mean also for the possibilities that are, that are ahead for us, and how to hold on to that? Because I think that's the biggest danger for me, is that if we can think about the fixedness or the fixity as part of the way that regimes of violence exact their power, fixing you in your place, literally. And of course, we can get into the racist sort of Orientalist tropes that are involved in that, and the racial hierarchies of you will stay in your place, and we have all the power in the world to keep you in your place. We can also transpose that to the context of this settler colony that is now known as the United States, and the ways, whether it's ICE raids or extrajudicial killings or any one of these things, about the expansiveness of their imperious egos. It's not enough just to expand actually in terms of borders. It's about making my presence known and felt, and that way you will fix yourself, right? And I think this is the part that I'm thinking about as we lay this out, about what's the moment upon us, and what do we constantly have to hold in mind around this impossibility possibility, right? Because it is a spectrum with every, I think we've talked about this before, that with every identification with power's reach, right? With its ability to exact its violence in the ways and manner it pleases, we are also invited into a disidentification from every person and every condition and every action that could actually free us up from that, right? And I think that's the part that's really important for us, is that these are not passive actions, right? At every moment in which we might think, this is done for. In every moment, and I've talked about this before, about writing the history of Palestine, of Lebanon, of Gaza before it even happens, is a moment in which We are disidentifying from every force and every person who's committing themselves every single day to bringing into being, to transmuting, to alchemizing everything that once felt impossible, that in that moment of actualization becomes possible. These are not just abstractions. These are what it means to live the praxis of liberation that you're talking about. Nothing becomes possible until it's possible in that moment, until it's actually enacted and actualized and practiced and leaned into, with all of its own contradictions and dangers. And like, I don't think people are not considering that as well. And that's the moment, that's the pause for us about, even with all those considerations, there's a push to actualize it for the possibility of what can come.
Yeah. Thank you. As you're both talking, I mean, the thing that comes to my mind is, well, kind of two things in a way, also to bring it back to Abdaljawad also, is like, so one of the things that has bothered me in recent months especially is the growth of conspiracism on the left, right? So the people who look to every act or everything that seems unlikely, or as if it must be planned, or and say, oh, there must be a conspiracy, like the deep state must be behind this, Mossad must be behind this, like these kind of things. And I think about that with respect to October 7th as well, that like, because it seemed so impossible to us, right? Like, how did they do this, right? Was like a moment, a thing that I think many of us felt on some level. And we could say this in terms of, how are they still resisting, right? How are there still videos coming out from Palestinian resistance fighters that are still resisting after all that we have seen, right? Is that does it exposes, it's why they don't show the videos of Palestinians dropping an IED into a tank or something like that to the world, right? Because they don't want people to think that is even possible, right? That level of resistance to their military is possible, right? That all of this militarism, all of this technology, of all of this surveillance, that it prescribes all possibilities, that like, it is irresistible in a certain way. And and so we saw, of course, those conspiracies with relation to October 7th as well, of like, oh, well, it must have been something that Netanyahu was aware of and allowed to happen, and this kind of thing, right? And there's always a tricky space, right? Because I do think we should investigate everything. I do think that we should try to understand the world, and there are conspiracies that happen, right? I always think of Orasami Burton reminding me that conspiring is a mundane act, that people conspire all the time. It just means really to breathe together, right? That's the conspirar, is the root of it. But having said that, it also, I'm very conscious that we need to actively not foreclose the possibilities of resistance, to not join in that project, right? But by seeing every form of resistance, and this is something that, where I'm taking it to you, Abdaljawad, that you've talked about in various ways, right? Of just the one, in terms of, even within like a dialectical materialist analysis that gets too focused on what are the objective conditions of the world, right? Like, what are the ways that power reproduces itself? And this is the other point, is you also talked about the Foucauldian issue early on in our conversations since October 7th, about this idea, right, that resistance is always just going to allow power to recalibrate itself, and and set in a new regime of power, right, for those who are already dominating, right? And what all of these frameworks can foreclose, and I don't, to my commie friends out there, I don't mean to suggest that I think dialectical materialism has to do that, right? Because I don't. But it's supposed to show you that there are possibilities through analysis, right? That, like, what are the actual things that we can analyze which produce possibilities for change. But that's an analytical exercise, and it is something else entirely to take the actions into your own hand and to change the world in the way that Palestinian resistance did on October 7th. And I think that's something that you've really held on to, Abdaljawad, and I think it's been difficult for you, even among your peers in Palestine, right, who are like, it's all of the ways, right, that we can talk about the horror and the genocide and the terror that has been enacted in response to this, and the way that using Lara's framework also is a part of the psychological operation of the military component as well. So we can move to another topic, but I'm happy to stay here a little bit if you have more to offer on that, Abdaljawad.
Well, I mean, Jared, there's a lot of different things in your question. I'll stay away from the dialectical materialism part because I don't want to get in trouble either. But so one of the things that I lean towards in generally my analysis, that I see resistance as, which is, also kind of an impossible word to actually use, which is an anti-concept, no? It does not, one of the problems with analysis around resistance generally in Palestine is that it tries to usually go to this utilitarian logic of means and ends. And this is where, politics emerges as what is the strategy here, what gets you from point A to point B in this kind of linear form of thinking. And I think one of my problems is that, having studied this history of resistance, just generally speaking, is that we should always see resistance as something that deforms rather than actually seeks a specific endpoint. It opens up possibility rather than something. And I've mentioned that quite a lot, so I don't want to repeat it for those who. It doesn't mean we shouldn't think about strategy and ends, it means, and all of these different things. And I think this is where here I will contradict the conspiracy theories. Although conspiracy theories are narratives, and one of the also symptoms of this moment is that we have so many conflicting narratives. This is one of the elements that actually coexist. We cannot really anchor ourselves, neither as Palestinians nor as Arabs in the region, nor as people interested in the question of Palestine, around, I don't want to say a homogeneous linear narrative about this moment and interval that has happened since, which is October 7th and the subsequent genocidal war that we have been witnessing on our phones. But there's very little agreement on how we can approach this and create actually a story that makes sense and anchors meaning. And this is where also something else emerges, the impossibility of language to capture this moment. This is another story. I don't want to go into it and go into an off-ramp. But when it comes to the idea of resistance as an anti-concept that deforms the existing order, I think that's what happened, no? We cannot deny that the order that existed before October 7th is not the order that exists now. And one of the things materially that we can see is that this order turned towards intense form of obscene genocide that, does not care about being scandalized. No, like this is one element of it. That's at least true. No, the second thing I think is, and this is perhaps a conjecture on my part, I think that on some level, return or liberation, because return and liberation, at least for us in Palestine, are kind of inhabit the same space, the same field of concept, could be attained perhaps through this architecture of extreme on the Israeli part. Meaning that I think one of the things about, or the ironies of this moment, is that it's specifically the very extreme components of Israeli society, the ones that are spearheading this expansionist settler movement, are the ones that will actually lead us towards return. And you can see it through their theatrics. Ben Gvir going to see, for example, Greta in prison, or Marwan Barghouti. You can see it in how they're willing to scandalize themselves. They can see it in their own wager, that they will be able to change the world in their own image, which is a wager. It's a wager that is incumbent of us to make actually, to make it fail. Because if it doesn't happen, Israel will have to reckon with what it has done, and its people have to reckon with the fact that from now on, the world will look in different eyes towards this colonial outpost, this small colony, and all the rhetoric about being a super Sparta will actually crumble on the weight of their own excess. So this is a long-term thing. But my question, I mean, it's a question: is it possible to conceive that liberation comes through this architecture and politics of the extreme? And I think if I'm looking from the lens of strategy, that a pragmatic Israeli government would have been able to double down on this moment as an opportunity, as the conspiracy theory says, and at the same time garner a lot of political results and accumulate it, and at the same time come out with at least moral or political and diplomatic legitimacy at the same time. And this architecture of extreme, of this attempt to actually decisively end the question of Palestine, which is something that I'm not sure will happen, even if the ethnic cleansing, I'm not sure that they will actually be able to attain. Of course, I keep it open because history is nothing inevitable in it. But at the same time, I think that, you know, this very architecture of extreme places, and I think this is something that I maybe I mentioned before also, and not to repeat myself too much, but I think this is one of the elements of the temporal moment of October 7th. Not to redeem it completely, and not that we cannot evaluate it negatively or say it was the wrong strategy at the wrong time, maybe we should have done something else. But it came at a moment where at least these populist right-wing fascist movements have not totally cannibalized the forms of states that exist across the West. And specifically because I don't think Israel breathes and lives without, you know, the West. Despite all the rhetoric of independence, eventually it is for me, it's a small colony. I don't buy all of the talk among many Arabs about it being an empire. It's not an empire. It's a small colony, dependent, and it will continue to be. They have their own sources of power, but, you know, we cannot really speak of it as such in grandiose terms, despite all the efficacy of their operation and intelligence and all of the things that are also given to it by many of the governments that support it. So there's that element. There's that element of that it came at a moment that is where change is occurring in the globe, but it's still not fulfilled. And of course, this moment could lead us to even more fascism, as we saw, and it does. And at the same time, this moment also hollows out these institutions, liberal institutions, that have maintained and sustained the legitimacy of this kind of forms of necro-capitalism, forms of neoliberalism, forms of, you know, all of the big words. I don't want to, like, you know, mention them all together. But, you know, it comes out with, like, hollowing out all of these institutions that have legitimated. And this is why, Jared, I always said and continue to say that this is actually a moment where perhaps those interested in revolution, not only in Palestine, but elsewhere, are capable of to think of its possibility. Because I think people have seen and witnessed the hypocrisy, contradiction of many things they have taken perhaps for granted or perhaps theoretically realized. But once you really truly inhabit that truth, that, for instance, you work for a company that is participating in genocide, you know, like, for instance, or that you are an unwilling participant in the destruction of another people, or that your universities that claim to be about diversity and freedom of speech are ones that are easily forced or not forced, easily willing to actually sell out their own students, that your pretensions around citizenship and rights are all, you know, could be easily shifted and changed. I think that is also part of this implosion paradigm that we have spoken about. So for me, conspiracy theories are interesting because I always see conspiracy in the conspiracy. Like, you know, like it tells me a narrative, it tells me something about those speaking, and it doesn't mean that there's no conspiracies in this world. No, I mean, Tony Blair talking to Trump and Jared Kushner, and, you know, this is about the future of, this is a conspiracy, you know, like they're trying to outline what form of Gaza exists. You know, that there's always conspiracies happening. Sykes-Picot dividing our region and making me into a Palestinian and making Lara into Lebanese, and, you know, creating all of these divisions across our region. Not that we're not divided before, of course. A lot of people jump and say, you know, we're divided, and we kind of love and hate each other at the same time.
Watching your flank here.
But at the same time, what I'm trying to say is that there are conspiracies, but the idea that Israel found this or prepared this as an opportunity, I think it's hard to believe on two levels. The first, it assumes that Israel is willing to sacrifice that many of its people in such an operation. Second, it assumes that Israel, who has been an obscene genocide, has been conducting an obscene genocide that doesn't care about, actually, at least for now, doesn't care about the repercussions, needed an excuse. And third, it assumed that this is not something that Israel was planning all along, which is two different things. Israel and this Israeli right-wing fascist groups pushing towards a decisive end has been part and parcel of their discourse for the past 30, 40 years, since 1967. You can hear them. The followers of Mir Kahana and his ideology are all about killing the Arabs, expanding the boundaries of the state, creating more room for Jews, populating Israel with more babies, and creating the condition for the erasure of the Palestinian people that started in 1948 with the labor and leftist, between quotes, governments of Israel, and of course now continues with this form of messianic right wing. So this has already been part of and parcel of that desire there, and they're pushing us, creating condensed forms of living, closing on us in nice or bad ghettos depending on where you live. In Ramallah it's a bit nicer, in other places it's less, and creating all of these hierarchies among us. But at the same time, that is a push that has been there for a long time. That's one thing. So if you're resisting, you know that this is coming at one point or another. And the second thing, how do you prevent it? Or how do you at least wager without guarantees to prevent it? Why do you build resistance if you're not going to try to at least contain it and create the alliance system? And of course, there's a lot of things to assess politically, how the axis of resistance was prepared or not. Did they make the right choices? Even on October 7th should have been maybe more limited. All of these questions can actually arise, and they're legitimate to actually evaluate. But the idea that there's this master conspiracy between Hamas and Netanyahu to provision, Netanyahu with the possibility of erasing Palestine, I think simply defies any form of reality, at least for me personally.
Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't mean for us to go there entirely because, I don't actually think it's that worth consideration, to be honest. But I appreciate you, laying all that out, Abdaljawad, because I agree with your assessment of it all. Lara, do you have something you want to add to that, or should we go to another question?
I just want to say something quickly and then we can go to it, is that, the part that I want to focus in on is this idea of, is liberation, Abdaljawad sort of asked us, is liberation possible? And I think this is it would be so this is why I always get so confused by people being like, this is such, might on the part of this Zionist project and look how smart they are. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, how easy would it be to be quote unquote victorious when you can infiltrate a shipping route and put a front for something for 17 years and then blow up pagers and then drop tons of, bombs on people and completely wipe out. Yeah, that's if that's the version of victory we're playing with, this is not even the same universe that that we're in, right? But I think the piece that I really want to focus on is that for us, liberation has to be possible in theory and in practice at any moment it presents itself, right? It has to be a possibility. And again, we're not saying there isn't strategy involved in it, but to seize moments when they come up, because that's part of it, as things unfold, that as you're strategizing, there are also openings, particular moments that come into being. And if we are focused and truly committed to the surety of liberation and return and dismantling structures, that violent structures in general, we have to also be at the ready, that liberation could come at any moment, that the struggle for that the forces will come together where we seize that moment and go. And I think this is to sort of say to people that any small act that people might be thinking about of like, what's the point? Or I feel like this is so small. But part of what Abdaljawad is saying also is that the idea is to stabilize a particular form of reality and structure that builds in its longevity and its surety over time. And every single moment that we disrupt its ability to continue on being uncontested, right? This is what Zionism has tried to do, to be an uncontested space, which itself has had many forms, by the way, right? And the hiding of its settler colonial project, and I'm not going to get into that, but to disrupt that at every moment. One thing I want to say, and both of us know this from region, Zionists are obsessed with legitimacy. They're obsessed with legitimacy because they are illegitimate, right? Because they know how this came into being, and they know that they cannot exist without the support of the superpowers that every day, right, basically slow to violence and
One second. Is Lara's audio cutting out a little bit for you, Abdaljawad?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, I thought it was just on. I just want to make sure. I think I'm not sure if it's your connection. You're muted right now, though.
Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It said my browser lost connection. What part of my rant did?
No, you were good. Just a minute ago. So you were talking about, you talked about Zionism and its legitimacy from the region, and then it started to cut out a little bit from there.
Okay, yeah. See, here's our conspiracy. It's just the way that power works, right?
Yeah. Perfect timing. Yeah.
Perfect timing. That's the thing. I mean, they're obsessed. Well, all I was saying is they're obsessed with their legitimacy. And I think this is part of why they're imploding on themselves. Because one thing also that we need to keep telling ourselves is there is no going back. Zionism's project, in its excess, as Abdaljawad was saying, in its imperiousness, which is its point anyway. There was no other way it was going to, unfold. It wasn't going to just sit back and be like, oh, we're good now. These are the borders we're fine with. This is the condition we're fine with. Whether it was on October 7th, 2023, or, a week later or 2 months later, that's the point of Zionism, was the entire sort of legitimization of their illegitimate settler colonial project to begin with. And you have to commit to that every day. We've talked about this before. Ideology is not just something, and a racist project is not just something that you half-ass and you go, okay, I'm good with this. There needs to be a continuing process and project of proving that legitimacy. And so disrupting it, making it contested at every moment, 2 years in, for us to attune to all the ways in which the settler project is a pariah state in which it can never go back to that moment. Now, it's on us to be like, what happens afterwards? What do we, like Abdaljawad was saying, is how do we continuously confront it? How do we make it hard for Zionism to sort of resettle itself in particular ways? I think that's happening across. We all see that. We need to actually believe that in and of itself is a worthy project, because the whole point is not to allow it to recohere around the parameters that it insisted on, that legitimizes, right, and disappears all the violence that was needed, not only at the inception of a state that's an overlay to Palestine from the river to the sea, but also in its continuation, everyday level continuation, right? I was just, and maybe Abdaljawad can speak more to this in another question, but I was just hearing that there's now more than 3,000 checkpoints, b'dafi, in the West Bank, right? And these are not just meant to spring up and then somehow not become part of the natural topography, and us to think about them as part of the natural topography of this. So it's just, for me, again, to come back to this, is to confront reality, is also to commit to disrupting of a reconfiguration of reality and a forgetting of the conditions that make this particular moment possible. And if you know that at the pulse of Zionism is a desperate plea to be seen as an entity that's legitimate like everything else, that's our call. Where in every space can we make sure to lay bare, not to create illegitimacy? That's not on us. They did it themselves, and they're continuing to do that themselves. We don't have to invent that. It's to lay bare all the structural pieces that show them to be exactly who they are: genocidal, eliminatory regime that is intent on reconfiguring this space so that all of us forget that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think from there, actually, what I want to do, and I do want to come back to, thinking about resistance and thinking about, what we can do in this moment and so on. But I do want to maybe actually hold that point and um and also talk a little bit about what's going on right now. Because I think so, Abdaljawad, I would love to hear, and I'm sure people would love to hear your kind of analysis of this, the ceasefire negotiations that are underway right now, and this kind of preliminary, you know, whatever. Like the way, I guess one thing to say it is, like, I was listening to Justin Potter, and one of the things that he says is there are things that feel different this time, when he was talking to Tarek, and they're talking about there are things that feel different this time in terms of the way that this is going down, and part of it is the way that even Trump is kind of saying, like, we have a deal, sort of, even as obviously there's a lot to be negotiated, right? But so I'm interested in your analysis, but I'm also interested in, for both of you as well, how do we not allow this to also be a kind of demobilizing, or a project of some form of normalization, or for all of ourselves, right? Regardless of whatever happens as a result of this. So those are kind of the two thoughts I'd love to chat with both of you about.
Uh, um, yeah. Thanks, Jared. I mean, I've been having a hard time putting my analysis hat, just generally, because I think I'm a bit, traumatized beyond, and I think I became a bit more wary or less confident of what I say when it comes to analysis. Just generally, not because, like, because analysts have to pretend they know, and and generally you don't. So I'll just say one thing, or not one thing. I'll probably be long, despite that introduction. But I'll say one thing, which is, I think this whole ceasefire paradigm emerges from three or four factors that are interplaying together. The first is, if you read the 20 points or 20 something points that Trump has laid out, it's basically an adoption that compromises between two paradigms I have spoken about: neutralization and ethnic cleansing in Gaza at the same time. What I mean by that is that, on the one hand, it takes elements of Arab peace proposals or a ceasefire agreement, which the Egyptians and the Qataris advanced before a year or so, which basically suggests that Gaza will become this kind of neutralized, pacified zone where the people remain, but at the same time there's no resistance, and a new form of governance, either the Palestinian Authority or somebody else, would come into existence with some Arab participation and troops. And the second element is that this kind of like Zionist interest in this is that, on the one hand, it would show the willingness of the resistance to surrender, lay down arms, create the condition for a passive Gaza. And of course, even if the war stops, what that means is that any moment in the future, the ethnic cleansing project can move without any form of resistance actually being there. So this is one element that exists. So there's this kind of, I don't think they're tension, they're complementing each other in a way that is actually very dangerous, and which means that even if we saw the end of massacres and destruction, at least for a while, this war has not ended. Like, this is at least my take, even if they announce some sort of prisoners exchange agreement and some sort of ceasefire. So this is one element of it. The second element that I would mention is that it's a compromise between the trinity of American management of the Middle East: Arab interest, and at the same time Israel, and of course the Americans being in the middle of this as well, coming on the heels of this relatively failed Israeli strike in Qatar, where I think some of the Arab leaders have taken that as a sign that Israel is willing to transgress beyond, these undefined rules. And now they're pushing maybe a bit harder for the Americans to actually try to find a real resolution and an end of the war, in which they will give Israel an off ramp from all of its excess. This is the dangerous part, is that the Arab countries are willing to actually normalize all of these massacres in a way that would actually, attempt to redeem Israel. I don't mean here on a public diplomatic lens. This is one of the elements that at least also exist, at least in that future, that those Arab countries and governments are willing to actually offer Israel what it could not actually gain through its massacres and war. So that's another element. It's how Americans are trying to balance interests. Egyptian rejection of ethnic cleansing into the Sinai, at least publicly, that's what we understand. Jordanian fear and anxiety around the Palestinians in the West Bank being thrown into Jordan. Saudi, Qatari anxiety around what that would mean also towards those countries that are pillars and buffer zones that separate them from any kind of immediate or close engagement with the Israeli state more broadly. In Lebanon, there are currents that want some sort of peace to emerge, this peace of surrender, of course, that are also willing to go down that road. In Syria, it seems the new regime is also bent on creating some sort of understanding with the Israelis. So you see this kind of like movements across the Arab world, but for that to happen, they need the end of the war to actually occur. And of course, the Arabs don't care if the Palestinians are without arms or resistance or anything like that. You can be neutralized, and maybe the Israelis will kick you out, but they'll kick you out slowly, or they'll kick you out later on in another episode of violence where you don't have actually the means to actually fight it off or create the conditions for your own survival, or at least some sort of maintenance of yourself in that scenario. So this is, I think, one element of also of the ceasefire agreement and why it emerges now, because there are these tense competing interests on stake. And this is what I was saying in terms of how the political architecture of the extreme in Israel is on the one hand moving towards this because it sees some sort of opportunity, but of course reticent and hesitant, because I think for them nothing short of the complete total destruction of Palestine and its people is the thing that they want, at least at this current moment. Whether they get it or not is a different story. I think the third element that is also pretty interesting is the extent to which you see business interest permeating the ceasefire agreement, like how Gaza is now reconceived as a place where Trump and his son-in-law and all of these Zionist billionaires alongside those countries and governments conceive of a different Gaza where land ownership can be changed, where the Palestinians can be given even fragments of what they had before, where something else will be rebuilt with Israeli settlements, and of course this kind of international hub that connects Gaza to the rest of the world, without the Gazans, of course, or with the Gazans being just the laborers and those who will actually labor within the construction of their own city that will not be theirs anymore. So this is also part of the plan, and it's integrated within its spirit. So at least from the proposal that we saw Trump advancing, there is some element to that. On the resistance front, I think for Hamas and the resistance generally, they did one of the most, I think, you can say, diplomatic genius moves we have seen for a while, in the way they framed their acceptance and rejection at the same time to the Trump's proposal. So they did a diplomatic coup that actually left all, I mean, it was funny because I was looking at Twitter at all these Zionists just astounded with Trump's endorsement of the Hamas statement on the one hand. And I think Hamas gave him that bait and he took it. So this was a very creative form of wording where they didn't concede, at least publicly. I don't know if they're conceding behind scenes, and at the same time agreed to the things that are actually very favorable to the Palestinians, which are ending the war, prisoners exchange, reconstruction of the Gaza. So they framed it in that way, but at the same time, talked about elements in the plan that they didn't like in a way that is very vague, and insisting on some sort of Palestinian unity as the form through which negotiations could happen. So there was a genius diplomatic move on the part of the resistance and its negotiators, and actually, one of my happy moments and is seeing people like, I don't know, Aaron David Miller, who's a Zionist lobbyist and pseudo intellectual that operates in the DC think tanks, getting like, oh my God, they've, because it actually, I mean, I'm going on an off ramp, so I'm sorry, but this is actually one of the things that we failed to do, even in negotiations in the past. We had, the idea of saying yes, but maneuvering in that space, being a bit smart about forms of wording. The Israelis were able to always kind of like frame us as rejectionists when we were not rejectionists, and in a way to delegitimize the Palestinian position more broadly. But I think in this environment, there's something in the past, if you want to talk about dialectics here, of learning the mistakes of those who came before, that is now emerging in also the forms of how negotiations is being conducted and how things are moving forward. It doesn't mean that the asymmetry of power, there's something else there, but at least in that kind of diplomatic space, we saw something that I think was specifically positive on the part of the resistance itself. So, I mean, the resistance is caught between very bad choices. So it will need to, at least in the eyes of, it will need to attempt to reach an agreement because it wants to stop the massacre and the annihilation of Gaza. This is the primary, most important, most significant thing for all of Palestinians, but specifically for Palestinians in Gaza, and of course the loved ones outside of Gaza, but also for all Palestinians. We want to see the end of the suffering. This is, we're done with it. Like there's something around that needs to be. It doesn't mean whatever political consequences, extending the war more will not produce any results. The idea of time being against the Israelis is also something we can entertain politically and otherwise, as governments are being pushed to take more positions, etc. But despite all of that, I think it's incumbent that the war ends, and I think the resistance also understand that if we can get an agreement that we can maneuver ourselves within and at the same time maintain our resistance, provision the Palestinians in Gaza their ability to be secure in their own land, and try to create reconstruction, I think they will go for it. I'm not sure what they're willing to concede on that road, but I think this is one of the things that the resistance will attempt its best to do, and it will attempt its best to ensure. But I think one of the things that have created such a gulf at this current point is that despite everything, nobody really trusts the Israelis at all in keeping anything. I mean, we never did, but specifically after the ways that they have transgressed every norm, etc., what guarantees can anybody provision where an end of the ceasefire and handing of the prisoners, the Israeli prisoners that exist in Gaza, would not necessarily be met eventually with the continuation of the war? So I think if we see political changes in the Israeli government, that might help. If we see something along that side of forms of guarantees that are serious and real, which I don't believe exists, because I think the whole world is conspiring against us and conspiring to kill the resistance and its ability to remain and sustain itself, but also conspiring to kill the Palestinian life more broadly. So I think that will be the problem, and I'm not sure we're going to really reach an agreement. And if it's an agreement, I'm not sure it will actually really last.
Thank you. Lara, you're welcome to reflect, also answer that same question, but also there was a second part of it, which I want both of you to take up, which I know I look forward to hearing your thoughts on, which is the, what is the moment demand of us, and how do we resist, as we've talked about this many times through many iterations of a potential, ceasefire agreement or whatever. Even if this one feels like it has maybe more legs than some of the previous ones do. I mean, Abdaljawad has also, just, shared his take also that he doesn't see it as, something that will likely hold long term.
Mhm.
But yeah, how do we stay, how do we keep our minds together and on the right things?
Yes. Well, first, I think I can speak for both of us in saying that Abdaljawad, you retain your analytic ability despite despite your concerns about that, which is very much appreciated, and I think this is part of it. What are the demands of us? I mean, I think we know. I'm not going to sort of go back into or rehash because I can't do it better than Abdaljawad did for us. Is that in many ways none of this should be surprising to us, right? And at the same time, two things. One, I want to bring in our revolutionary George Abdallah, who, since his liberation, has continuously said it is those who are struggling that are the decision holders about how things proceed. And I think there's something really important politically about us being able to maintain our ability to analyze and see what's happening, and still also recognize that if we can trust people to fight the fight of liberation, that there are ways in which we also need to show that, the lay of the land is much more apparent. And I think that is a trust game. It's also one that says it's a long struggle. I think this is what I hear Abdaljawad saying, is that this is a moment in a longer struggle. And I think for us to understand that we can retain the ability to say what Diana Bhutto the other day was saying is a repackaged, sort of, a peace plan, but it's a repackaged Zionist plan. But of course, if we see who are the players here, and this sort of bold-faced old school colonialism. I mean, we're not allowed to say settler colonialism because that's offensive to Zionists, because Zionist feelings are hurt if we say settler colonialism. But this bold-faced old school Orientalist sort of colonial holding imagination that they have about what's going to happen to Gaza should be fine. I think that's the other piece for us, is to remember that we live in a different world. One of the things, and to hold on to that reality that we live in now and read this going forward and hold on to what we know as a way of what is demanded of us, what we need to continue doing. So let me just be the one who says it. Divest from every fucking traitorous state, right? I mean, I think as Arab, those of us who believe in our revolutionary futures, we're not investing much in these states. But I think it's really important for us to name who are the states that are involved in this. In terms of Lebanon, for example, understanding that as they sort of have lip service to disarming Hezbollah and all these sorts of things and these peace plans, they're building this massive surveillance, embassy in Lebanon. And the United States has been arming Christian right-wing militias as well. So this is the psychic militancy of retaining clarity on all the moving pieces, that as we see this, it's incumbent upon us to keep our eyes on all the pieces that are involved in this, so we aren't lulled into a false reality of what's happening. I think many of us, even those of us who are committed, sometimes can get pulled into this confusion because it's such a theater that's involved and there's so many moving pieces, and the next day there's something and it feels so ridiculous and ludicrous and over the top, and we can roll our eyes on it, but there are all these moving pieces that are actually really important. Or the traitors United Arab Emirates being behind the murder that's happening in Sudan, or the Qataris and their obsession with legitimacy, the money that's involved in that, Saudi Arabia's part in that. This is not contradictory to our position against imperialism. To understand that this has been a decades-long, if not longer, project. We are seeing the end point. So the pull is to be like, here's this moment, but to understand it as part of a larger project that gives us kind of clues about all the places we need to be fighting, about that this is an internationalist struggle, that this is the global solidarity that's being built is going to be even more important because the restructuring of our region has ripple effects across the world, and that is what is incumbent upon us as comrades to come in and say, what does it mean for us, to be those people that are constantly talking about United States imperialism, about the project of anti-capitalism, how we must be anti-capitalist, how we must be internationalist, and to remain focused about all the conditions that brought this into being. So if we can take that as this is a moment that makes sense in this larger structure, of course it's going to. I mean, any one of us reading that fucking peace plan, the FAQ is at the bottom. This is the thing that got me. You look at it, of course, the the West Bank is not even mentioned in all of this. There are no guarantees for Palestinians, only guarantees for Zionists. None of that is surprising. The first, frequently asked question at the bottom is, who is Hamas and why are they attacking Israel, right? So again, sort of accepting this as part of the project and then seeing all the ways in which people resist and are defiant despite that. It's the same link back to October 7th, not to get lost in the fascistic theater of all of it, but recognize that there are attempts at life, that there are attempts at futures beyond this, that there's an insistence that Palestine continues to exist. There's an insistence that resistance will continue. And this is the last thing that I'm going to end on here, is that when October 7th, when Tufan Al-Aqsa happened, right? I think there were many factions, and I'll speak to our region, that thought that that moment for resistance was gone. And something else happened. This is the same invitation right now, is that even as we see the forces of capital and empire coalescing together for their interests, is to not forget that possibilities are always created underground in ways we can't think of, in the most ingenious ways, in the most creative ways, in ways that conditions of oppression force us to reconfigure the way we fight, and how we realign, right? Divestment is at the heart of that. It's not just BDS divestment. Yes, please. Okay, we've been doing this for decades. But what does it mean to also psychically divest from all the possible, that the only things we thought were possible, or how this moves forward, right? And then in the moment of respite, in the moment of, okay, what is needed right now immediately, a reminder that there's a massive purposeful starvation campaign that is happening in Gaza. And to us not be imperious about what it means for aid to come in, right? But don't rest there. It can't be the end point. I think sometimes this sort of gets stuck in time, and then we think about this even in our imagination as, oh, this is the end point. That's what feels like a defeat. This can't be the end point. This is a long struggle. If we're committed to liberation, the next moment is going to be upon us immediately as well. And I think for us to trust in the ways that the world has been reconfigured and changed irreparably because of Tufan Al-Aqsa, because of Gaza, because of Palestine, because of the resistance across the world, and lean into that as we sort of search for, okay, what's the next demand on us?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I want to kind of stay there, because I think we can, I mean, I don't know if there's other things that you all wanted to get to, but I thought we would go back a little bit to October 7th and also think about, a lot of what you just laid out there, Lara, and, thinking about what, sitting ourselves in this moment and, moving forward. And I mean, I think one of the interesting things, I said at the outset of this that I don't think any of us had in our mind on October 7th, 2023, that we would be here now, right? Like the impossibility of that form of resistance was, had, it was, I'll use the phrase exhilarating, even though I know Jody Dean was attacked for saying that phrase, in those moments. But I think that on the flip side also, and to again go back to your framing of the dream and the nightmare, we also didn't have a way to envision the nightmare that would be unleashed as a result of these liberatory, these attempts at liberation, right? These liberatory actions. And I think that in thinking about that, and thinking about a lot of your work around time, Abdaljawad, um, both early um, early reflections by way also of Basil al-Araj, of the idea that resistance always has a utility in time, um, and on the flip, as we've moved into this, and I mean, I always say this, but sooner than many, you had a realization. I want to say, like, maybe by March of 2024, that this was going to be a much longer, genocidal counterinsurgency war, because as I remember you putting it at the time, there just wasn't the fabric within Israeli society that could stitch itself back together without a continued genocide, basically. Um, but at the same time, you have also held up along the way that as they have continued this, right, they have also, shown the world fully, what the Zionist settler colonial project is and what the conditions of it are. And as a result, it has become a pariah state to the people of the world, right? And I think this is always I'm always Palestinians, and particularly folks in Gaza, have many times talked about how the world has let them down, and that's absolutely true. But there's also these layers of, the nation state level of the world, the UN level of the world, the institutions of the world, and the people who, I think, at least at a level of feeling and affect and, heart and mind, I believe, are firmly with the Palestinians, probably more than ever, regardless of where they are. And so in that, we also have to think about that, w- whatever happens with this deal or doesn't or whatever, that this commitment is a long-term one, right? I mean, any anti-colonial struggle, and certainly the Palestinian struggle, we shouldn't think of in just a 2-year term in terms of a resistance struggle, right? It goes back decades as well. Goes back to the beginning of the Zionist project, even before there was a Zionist state. So but all of the anti-colonial struggles are long-term projects. They're not, they never work on the neat timelines that we would like of, there's this moment, there's this battle, right? And then the colonial empire just, walks away and licks its wounds and says, okay, you have freedom now. That there are these, horrible costs that are impossible for us to bear, and even more impossible for Palestinians and the people in Gaza to bear. But yet that is, in some ways, something that we can't escape as much as we would like to. And so I just want to reground there, and thinking about also ways that we uphold that and continue to like, what does it mean to hold all of that, and do so in a kind of dignified way, and not, um not make it cheap also, because obviously these are like millions and million, hundreds of thousands of lives destroyed, and all kinds of things. It's very heavy, right? But at the same time, like, how do we hold that heaviness and still be a part of, the eventual liberation of Palestinians, I guess we could say, right?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't believe in eventualities and inevitabilities, so we might also be erased. So, and this is why the stakes are high as well. No, um, because when I say, for instance, ceasefire does not mean. I mean, I always said this here. There's never an end to the war in Palestine. Just never ends. Maybe it won't make the news, but there's always war. I mean, and maybe even October 7th could be also looked upon as a way to interrupt the world and tell them, hey, we're here, like, look at what they're doing to us for, decades. So it's also a way to like expose the slow, silent, perhaps, war that actually unfolds on a daily basis. So this is one thing. A ceasefire maybe ends these kind of intense massacre and attempted genocide, perhaps. And I already outlined that that doesn't mean that ethnic cleansing will not happen in other forms, that people will not be stripped of everything that they have in Gaza and then rendered as people that have to find somewhere else to go. Of course, on that front, the only thing preventing perhaps that, alongside the insistence of many Palestinians in Gaza to remain in Gaza, is the fact that the world doesn't want us. Even the Americans have canceled any visas for Palestinians. So we're caught in this kind of duel. Even if we want to leave and just leave Palestine for them, we don't have that luxury, really. So the other thing I would want to say around the question of time, I think one of the things that when you see kind of these type of intense, hyper visible forms of massacres, hunger, killing, and torture that the Palestinians have been undergone, is that you want the world to stop. This is the reaction that is very visceral, very real, that you just want the whole earth to stop, and you want time to stop moving, and you want this to end now. And that is a visceral reaction, but it's a visceral reaction where people sometimes confuse that with politics. And what I want to mean by that is that nothing can come that urgent to actually really stop the genocide in the now time of the genocide. But I think Gaza is changing the world, will change the world. The question is how, not if it will change the world. It did change the world. It will be changing the world. It's a global planetary event. It will have consequences not only on the Palestinians, not only even on the Israelis and whether they're legitimate or not, or whether they're it will have consequences on our entire globe. So the question is, what forms of consequences? And that also includes the Arab world, because I think also what happened in Gaza in the past 2 years will have deep ramification and repercussions on the Arab world and any political movements that start to organize and build themselves in the future. It might come late, it might come earlier than anticipated, but things will also in the Arab world significantly and radically shift. I don't think we'll remain in the same position as we were before October 7th. It doesn't mean we'll go somewhere better. It might end up being worse. I'm not as hopeful as people tend to claim that I am, as many of my friends call me the merchant of hope. But I think that this is one of the elements that we also need to recognize, that visceral need for things to stop now is not necessarily synced with the political clock of how things change. Electorally, politically, building movements, organizing, this is all important. And for people interested in the issue of Palestine, not only out of Palestinian salvation or, oh, look at the Palestinians, pour them pity or fear, but also interested in their own liberation, Palestine has to be central to their own organizing and politics, and also their own institutional building, own organizational building as they move forward. Because if we did not notice, Palestine has that capacity to change the world. So if you're a revolutionary, you should be invested in it. You should be invested in it out of your own, necessarily, of course, out of moral commitment, ethical commitment on all of these different things, but at the same time, out of your interest in changing the world and in changing the existing order. So this is one element that people should keep in mind, because one of the things that you were mentioning, Jared, and this is where I don't give people prescriptions of what they should do. Of course, there are, Palestinians have called for BDS, and this is something that people already know. What they should do and how they should organize and what forms of politics they should adopt. I don't like to give prescriptions because I don't know, honestly, and I feel that's something beyond me, because I think politics in different localities across different geographies in different places has takes different perhaps forms and communities and intimacies and all these different elements that come with it. But what I would say is that Palestine has to be central, not because of Palestinians. I mean, you can even hate us as Palestinians, as most of the Arabs do, but still love Palestine, no? And that's one of the things that I would encourage, and of course place front and center as you move forward. Again, if you're interested in change, this is a place that has the capacity to change and shift the world in meaningful ways, and that's something that should stay with us. I'll say one last thing, and then I'll stop. I think also it's not necessarily the movement time is working for Israel. It is, destruction of homes, built environments, hunger, exhaustion, torture. It is operating on the ability of the Palestinians to withstand and endure what is actually unendurable. And in that sense, maintaining it in that impossible position of enduring what is not endurable is something that will also have deep ramifications on us as a society, not only in our social composition, not only in our unity, not only on our ability to actually withstand each other. I mean, all this anger that we have bottled up, for instance, in the West Bank, if it does not actually blow up towards the colonial regime itself, it will just blow up inwardly, and we'll start screaming at each other more and more. So I can see a lot of dystopian images coming to my mind on our own future as a society and a community, if things remain as they are, or the relationship between Gaza and the West Bank, or Palestinians in the diaspora and Palestinians inside, or Palestinians with Arabs. All of these different things have ramifications, and we can speak of them in different way, but doesn't mean that time only moves in favor of Israel and its expansionist settler project. I think in many ways also Israel is imploding. In many ways also Israel is saturated with its own excess. Also Israel is incapable of really coming out of this war, not only with legitimacy and non-legitimacy, but coming out with this war, saying to itself a narrative of revival and asserting its independence once again in a meaningful way in which it can actually feel comfortable and secure with its own self, despite all the successes that it has tactically. I mean, the pager attacks, the walkie-talkies, assassinating, one of its most significant, one of the most significant voices and arch enemies of Israel, somebody like Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, creating, bombing Iran and getting the Americans to finish the job of destroying much of the nuclear facilities. Even despite all of that, it really cannot really still build that narrative. And in that sense, and a unified narrative around its own place, legitimacy, and security in its own eyes. It's not about us, it's in its own eyes, and be convinced and convincing. And of course, as much as the world will remind it of what it's doing, as much as they will confront the anger and the revulsion of the world, as long as that will also remain with them as they move throughout this globe, despite having these allies in high places that are continuing to support the Israelis in a meaningful way. And of course, that I talked about the contradiction for within Jewish history in Europe, that kind of like enclosing on self could be productive at the same time as it's quite problematic. And this is why we have the Super Sparta speech that Benjamin Netanyahu gave recently, where he claimed that Israel should move towards being the Spartan society that of course is untenable. Okay, I said the last thing, but apparently I have one more. So
Yalla.
I think one of the other things that I just wanted to end with is that since the beginning of the war, I used to write in Arabic mostly. I didn't write really much in English. And in the beginning of the war, I decided, okay, there's a lot of people that write in Arabic, and I can still write sometimes in Arabic and perhaps shift some of my work in English because there's an interest in the world. Perhaps somebody or some people among us have to also write and maybe help whatever in what capacity, of course, without exaggerating any form of importance to what I do, because I don't think it's important. But in one nutshell, I would say is that we cannot, the question of what Palestinian, for instance, intellectuals do with people who become stupid when they hear the narrative of Palestine, people like in high places, like the German chancellor, for instance, or journalists who are not only, if Edward Said a long time ago wrote this article called, an essay called Permission to Narrate, and he was kind of diagnosing how, the Palestinians have no right, they're excluded from the ability to narrate their own story. I don't think that's our problem today. I think the problem is that there's such an administered ear, so willing to accept the stupidity of ChatGPT statements coming from Israel, so willing to accept these legitimation campaigns from, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, being spread to journalists, because not only are they complicit, but they're also ideologically and politically invested in this project. So there is this breakdown into stupidity, where like smart people become stupid, and we've seen it among intellectuals and philosophers and people in media and people across the various institutions. And you really can't cure somebody who's smart but is willing to be that stupid. You can't cure it. That is not willing to hear, or if he hears, he's easily willing to disavow what he's hearing, or if he's hearing and listening at the same time, and at the same time trying to inhabit the truth of what he's saying, he breaks down and collapses and cannot actually inhabit it. So these are some of the signs of things we in Palestine face historically when speaking to this Western ear more broadly. And I mean here Western in the big W, not the people, but people on the level of political elites and ruling classes. And you don't know what to do. And I think this is why I think our wager has always been on the empathy and the capacity to build relations across borders, relations across across various identities, across races, across whatever it is, and create that space of intimacy and empathy, where I think peoples on the ground are our wager. They're the wager that we can really bet ourselves on, at least in the future, that they will come and they will place Palestine front and center in their own politics, in their own lives. And of course, not only remember what Israel has committed, but also make sure that that never happens again.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Lara.
Yeah, Abdaljawad, I like you as the harbinger of hope. Not as the Obama hope version, but let's sort of like, this is, there's a way in which I'm thinking about revolutionary optimism, right? Which is not an empty, like we're just, running on fumes and vibes, like Kamala style. For me, revolutionary optimism is a commitment to pressurize conditions such that they must change. And that's, I think, the piece that I'm continuously going back to, that if we're reflecting today and we're here sort of still making meaning, I mean, this is why this is so helpful, because it's not like all these things are, taken care of, or that we're in agreement about things, that they're constantly in motion and they're dynamic processes, precisely because yes, the stakes are so high. And like you're saying, Jay, I really appreciated this sort of like being able to hold in mind and in dignity and dignify the reality. These are not abstractions. And I think sometimes, I know we're careful about these conversations not veering off into abstractions, but it can't be said enough that there are real living beings under the boot of this. And I think that's the piece. And it's not in a sort of like liberal way of this, oh, they're just humans. No, they're Palestinian, they're Palestinians who live in Gaza who are being genocided and exterminated. And I think every moment for us to make sure that they live in their full embodiment in our minds, in our hearts, in the way that we think about things, in our commitments, that is part of it. But for me, the revolutionary optimism versus the hope is the commitment that whatever it takes on an individual and structural level, and we're constantly commuting between the two to make sure that the conditions change, not only that it becomes different, but that where Abdaljawad ended, that the conditions are dismantled such that this could never come into being again. And that's a larger question. That's one that is a continuous form of us studying, acting, organizing, pushing upon, but it is it has to be a centering force for us. And this is the thing, going back to, like, I just received your question as a reflexive one of like, okay, here we are now. Yes, we're looking backwards, but we're looking forwards. What are the ways in which we've consolidated certain things? What are the things that are continuously in motion and have to be in motion? Because if this is the revolutionary optimism of pressurizing things, it's moving away so that they don't settle. And I'm saying this specifically when we're talking about the condition of settler colonialism, that things settle within us psychically and in our psychic terrain and in our interiority. They're meant to settle there and ossify. And that continuous dynamic process of revisiting and reflecting and pushing upon and pressurizing make sure that that movement is constantly there. That's the psychodynamics of this. If things are in movement, they also are less likely to cohere in a way that's going to stabilize and, shore up the very structures that made this genocide possible despite the fact that there have been many people screaming into the wind for decades and decades and decades, that continuing to unsettle this. That's what I mean also by making it contested, every space a contested space. But for us to have this conversation, I think it was the first conversation we had, Jay, after Tufan Al-Aqsa, where we talked about also that part of this is contending with what revolution and liberation struggles really look like. I think there are ways in which those of us who are committed to revolutionary struggles, rightfully so, because I think we need this to sustain ourselves, think about the romanticism that's involved in it. There's an aesthetic that's involved in it. There are examples of history of successful liberation struggles, and we use those to help sustain us and to understand that these are not, impossibilities, like Abdaljawad was sort of laying out for us, that liberation is always a possibility waiting to sort of come into being. And also that I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors by not understanding that part of what is involved in that is tremendous loss. Tremendous loss, comrades we lose, people who die, people who are martyred, who are murdered in the most outrageous, violent of ways, so that they become things that we document in the future to sustain our struggles for the ongoing fight against power and oppression that recalibrates itself. And that's the thing. It's if we're fighting for anything, it's so that it's not just a select few people that always have to shoulder this burden of their own documentation, of our documentation, of a reminder of how this works. It's to really hone in on that piece and say that part of, for me, what dignifies a liberatory process is for us to understand that life and death are always imminent. Again, the relationship to life and death when you are under settler colonial conditions, when you're circumscribed by a violent system that wants to make sure that it dictates every part of your life, that the possibilities of life and death are always there. And the relationship you have to them are different. And the choices you make to navigate that and orient yourself are different. And I think we have to really sit with that, like the fullness of the affect that's involved. And this goes back to your comment about exhilarating. I'm going to say something tongue-in-cheek, as I often do, but like if photos or images of people breaking out of a condition that was meant to feel impossible, impenetrable, and to be permanent does not exhilarate you on the most fundamental level, that the possibility of breaking free for all of us exists in that moment, then you must forfeit your extractiveness of every single fucking revolutionary struggle that you take from, that you use, that you quote, that you... I have no patience for this anymore, and there's no in between. Like, I'm okay after Joad with taking the strong line position. I'm like, this is the thing I am sure of. If within you can't connect those dots, then you're not allowed the innocence to extract from those histories for whatever affective reason you need to sustain yourself going forward. There's also a way in which we have to document, pay attention to, and analyze the deeply embedded racism that's involved in this. Anti-Palestinian racism, that the heart of it is anti-Arab racism. What are the ways in which the infrastructure of the racism of empire, particularly in our region, makes it such that there is a pause even? What is it that's within us that would pause here but not there, right? I think we joked about this, about like Battle of Algiers being everybody's favorite fucking movie. Well, you're not allowed to watch that movie anymore. You're not allowed to access that movie. You're not allowed to watch it anymore. You're not allowed to gain any sort of pride or any of it anymore if you can't also attend to what is the affective pause inside of you that can't connect these dots. You don't get to siphon off the energies of people who committed themselves to the struggle and were martyred for the futures we now live in if you can't contend with this moment right now. And maybe that's a call also for movements, particularly in the context of the global north, that always have these conditional places and statements that are a part of it, whether that's dictated by fear or surveillance or anything else. I think there's another confessional that's there that those of us Arab have always had to contend with. What does it mean to live as an Arab in the world where your life and your future and your liberation and your dignity is always caught up in conditional statements, whether that's an allegiance to Zionism or having to pay for the ills and the evils of a fucking Nazi Germany or Europe's plunder of the world or any one of these things. The moment is upon us. This is the reflective process of like, are we committed to dismantling every oppressive system? And if so, racism and xenophobia and the imperial regime of racial capitalism has to be a part of that too. And I think all of that is encompassed in Tufan Al-Aqsa, in the imagery, and us sort of really taking this seriously. And I don't think we'd be doing justice, if that's the word I can use, to the immense nature of these atrocities and to the people who every day commit themselves to living a different life and to changing the world, like Abdaljawad was saying, and like you said, Jay. If that's not also part of our thinking and our reflection and the conversations and pushing upon the seams, the pressurizing, like continuing to pressurize this, if nowhere else among comrades.
Yeah, thank you. One phrase that came to my mind a few times during this conversation, and I kept forgetting to bring it up, but it came back again with that, which is another very early conversation I had after Tufan Al-Aqsa was the one with Fred Moten. And in it, he had this call of like, I don't remember, but I was talking about something along the lines. I really don't remember exactly what I said, but my memory of it is something along the lines of me saying, that Palestine and the axis of resistance, that they have put anti-colonial struggle like back into the world, right? And he said something that I don't think I know that I didn't fully it didn't fully resonate with me in the time at the time in the way that it does now. And with the benefit of all the kind of hindsight that we have, which is something along the lines of asking the question, how do we renew our anti-colonial practices, which he was saying it because he also offered that Palestinians can't hold the weight of anti-colonial struggle for the whole world all by themselves, right? And I think that the last couple of years, part of what I have seen is a lot of people actually genuinely trying to figure out how do we restore those practices, but in a context in which, and I think this is a really important thing, they had long ago sort of accepted the impossibility, right, of something like an October 7th, something like a Tufan Al-Aqsa, right? And so the networks or the organizations or the forms of resistance that would have been necessary, that are necessary to really join a struggle like that in the fullest expression, we're not there, right? And this is the same thing. I mean, to the flip side of what you said earlier, Lara, about the ability of like the propaganda empire to like sweep into motion, and how it only happens because that infrastructure is there, it's built, it's set up for that purpose, that we have to be really conscious, right, about building infrastructure, institutions, organizations, and those that we have also thinking very seriously about these questions of, how do we get to a place, and not letting that place be so far off in the future, and also not letting that um the assessment, which I think is a real assessment that a lot of organizations have about the risk, about the level of surveillance, about the costs, the sacrifices, right, that are involved in taking more heroic forms of action, right, in being protagonists in that struggle in a more direct way, right. There is a cost, right? And we have to be very honest about that and assess that as well. But it is the only thing, right? Is that these struggles cannot happen just in isolation, and there is a great amount of power in this world which has been exposed through this, that we all have to work together to overcome. Um, and so I think it's just very important as we kind of start to wind down, and you both are welcome to say anything final you want. There's a few things in the chat. I'd love to shout out good things that people have shared along the way. But for us to hold that, and just move forward in that with the kind of, again, that's part of the dignity for me too, is like I think we've all been in some ways. I think Abdaljawad and I have talked about this, and Lara, you and I have talked about this. Like, there's a humiliating aspect of this for everyone as well. I think that once, wanted October 7th to lead to, a free Palestine, like that we're not all able to swing into the motion in the way that would actually be required, right, to accelerate that thing. And it's not, again, not to be defeatist, not to say that a lot hasn't shifted and changed, because a whole lot has. And you both have been great over the last couple of years of helping us document those things as they're happening. Um, and another thing I want to just say is shout out to Yemen. I know that that's like it's a kind of side, but like in this in this conversation, I'm also sitting here in my mind thinking like we also have to hold all of what Yemen has borne in terms of its sacrifices, all of what the resistance in Lebanon, all of the the like everywhere where people have resisted and have made sacrifices, including people in the imperial core who have made sacrifices, that it is really important to also, continue to hold all of them, and to not forget, not to allow ourselves also to, to turn our backs on them, or to, look away, because perhaps also looking at them makes us sometimes feel shame that they acted in the way that the moment actually required and we weren't able to, right, for whatever reason. And so yeah, that's the last thing on my mind. Both of you are welcome if you want to offer any more closing remarks, and I will pull up some things from the chat after that, and we can say our goodbyes.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if. Well, look, the other day I met a friend who just came out of prison by coincidence, and I didn't recognize him, so I greeted him as a stranger because his entire physical appearance has at least radically shifted in a ways that I, couldn't recall his image. Like, and that made me not feel only ashamed and apologize 100 times, and but it left me with a sense of bitterness about how much this interval that we're living through is one where specifically here in the West Bank is kind of uncanny in the sense that you're within the domain of the genocide, but you're outside of it. You can disavow its existence, but you live with the shame of it. It's something similar to what a lot of people across the world also perhaps feel. Should I look towards what's happening or look away? Should I inhabit the truth of the moment? How easily killable, easily torturable, easily eliminated our bodies are? Or should I pretend that nothing is happening or place it at the edge of my consciousness? I think we're struggling with a lot of different affects at this moment, and I think shame is one of them. Shame as one that is also a marker of the failure to meet the demands of the moment, the failure to inhabit its entirety and its truth. And I think, as you mentioned, there are those who inhabited that truth in ways that a lot of us failed and to do. And that kind of gulf, if you want, or distance between the truth and the failure of inhabitation is something that we should sustain. I don't think it's something that we should resolve or redeem. It's something that we should sustain because it is also a place from which politics can perhaps still emerge and find a way forward as we move on. And I think this is also goes back to our conversation. One of the fears around having a ceasefire, for instance, is that it resolves that for people. And if that's the only thing that that is moving them, that just the constant killing and massacres, it becomes a way in which, now it's done. I can go back to my everyday life and forget that anything happened, or perhaps not forget, but at least push it even further and further from the horizon of our consciousness. So having said that, I would say that there is an importance to sustaining that shame, and it's importance to sustaining the anger that comes with it, not in an unproductive way turned against the self, but against the world that makes what we've seen happening and still happens possible, and against the forms of politics, relations across, whether they're structural in the larger materialist sense, or whether they're interpersonal, or whether they're somewhere in between. These are all things that we need as humans, and I don't know what that category means anymore, as humans, to actually really visit and revisit and rethink in ways, and I don't think rethink, but also conceive forms of practices around it that actually again that makes sure that this doesn't happen at all in the future, not to us, not even to our enemies. So just that I would make that clear. This is one thing that I also want to take as a lesson. Perhaps maybe it's too far-fetched for many that would challenge me, but also not to the enemy in the way that this type of brutal, blinded forms of insisting on domination and power and killing, and learning all the long lessons from the history of Nazism, for instance, and applying it elsewhere, not even avenging the Nazis themselves, but avenging against bodies that have not really participated in the attempt to exterminate the Jews in Europe. These are all, these are things that we should all really sustain. And I think for me, anger has become something that needs to be cultivated more and more. And I don't mean anger as this kind of blind moment of hatred, but anger at this world that really we live in. As Ghassan Kanafani says, a world not ours. And I'll end here for me.
Shukran, Abdaljawad. I'm going to go to the affect and say you've created a space where we can do that together, where we can tap into it, where we can feel it publicly, we can model it. affect is sustaining. The wound is sustaining. I want to remind people that we live in a world that seeks to, Abdaljawad was just saying this, release us of this. You know, I've talked about my dear friend, psychoanalyst Avgi Sakatopoulou, who talks about like keeping the wound open. My version of that is saying that the symptom is a register of something. And I think we live in a world that rushes to close those up, and to think about the ways in which the psychopolitical affective plays a central role in that, because the closing up is not an innocent closing up. The closing up stabilizes forces. And so if you're going through today or tomorrow, or you've been in the fields of all of this, it's a reminder that there's a sustaining force there. Our political prisoners have taught us that for ages. Resistance fighters have taught that to us. There's something deeply sustaining and cohering and stabilizing and grounding about affect. I've also said before that I think we need to commit ourselves to be seared by this and not expect to live in a world in which a genocide can happen and that we don't carry it with us. That is another type of commitment, right? And I think dwelling in that space is not one that weakens us. To the contrary, it's one that sharpens our ability for psychic militancy, for the focus we need, for the deep-seated love, revolutionary love that is needed to sustain us and our movements against the crush of violence, which I think we can expect will not only continue, but intensify. It's in the moment of breaking out. Maybe this is what Fanon would call desalination, right? Is that in the moment of breaking out of the conscriptions of violence that you feel it in its most intense form. And that is through affect, but also through the actual brute force that the state brings upon you, or the violence. And so I think my call to folks is dwell in that space. And that's not it doesn't have to be a demobilizing space where we're socialized to think that affect, particularly deeply felt affect, whether it's anger or sadness or any one of these things, is demobilizing. I don't think so. I'll end with the fact that I love that, Abdaljawad, you started by saying you wrote a piece early on about like grief. And after the August 4th, 2020 blast in Beirut, I wrote a small piece called Grief Suspended in Explosion, being like, it's perpetually suspended, not in a like maudlin way, or I'm like sitting there, you know, being indulgent in these feelings, but to say that the project of dismantling what created the conditions for this has not yet been dismantled. And that is the suspension of it. Maybe that's the parallel here, is that we suspend the end point of grieving or any one of these affect because the conditions remain. And that's our pulse here. So suspending the moving through, suspending the repair, suspending the cure. And this is me as a shrink saying that, like, lean into that, folks. This is not about freeing ourselves up of it. It's about actually, you know, hunkering down and us being the ones that settle, not settler colonialism or violence.
Awesome. Thank you both for this wonderful conversation today. I know that it's definitely something that I needed, and I can tell by a lot of comments in the chat, and you know that many people feel the same way. I'm just honored to have had the opportunity to talk to you both so many times over the last couple of years, in particular about, I know Lara and I have talked a few times before that, but definitely our relationship has deepened over the last couple of years. And Abdaljawad, we met. Shout out to Louis all day too for the suggestion that I reach out to you for the first time, and for all the conversations that we've had. So I'm going to read some different things off in the chat. So first of all, Francis, thank you for the contribution to the platform. Cannot imagine the last 2 years without these three analysts. Grateful for each of your brilliance, courage, militant clarity, and revolutionary love. Thank you, Francis. I love this. Our revenge will be the laughter of our children, inshallah. You know, this resistance is the legitimate eternal right of the people. I mean, this was one of the, you mentioned the response that Hamas had written that uh, Trump posted on social media. A friend of ours, I can't remember who said it, otherwise I would give them credit, but they were like, I think he just read to the part where they gave him a compliment and tweeted it out before reading the rest of the statement. um, but uh, but yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? Is that you know, that I really deeply appreciate, as difficult as everything is, that the reminder by the resistance that this is a legitimate right to of Palestinian people to you know, have defensive arms and to resist occupation, right? Um, it is extremely important to organize. Gaza is a genocide, and there are wars all over the world. Absolutely, you know, the only way that we will be able to build the world that we want is through organization. Someone else said that Palestine is truly the axis of the world at this moment. And David Silberg responded, yes, because it's about dismantling the political and economic elites that created this situation. Um, um, so I don't know why the YouTube artificial intelligence removed your comment to kick cash to Palestine funds like Samir Project, but that's all the more reason for people to do so. And there's a link in our show description that they can't take away. So unless they take us down, which, you know, someday maybe. Okay, so this is a question that many people have, Lara, and you have to answer this for folks of whether you have an actual tattoo of a kufia on your arm or hand, or if it's henna. I know the answer, but you have
This
to tell
is
them.
henna. This is henna, but it's pretty badass. Has me considering.
Yeah.
It's henna. Shout out to henna artist Amal, who's in Dearborn, who did it for me.
Right on. Flotilla folks are still being held. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. We actually probably should have said something about this today, you know, maybe in a future conversation. But what I'll just say quickly is I do think also that the most recent, you know, Gaza Samud flotilla and all the people who participated in it, and so many boats, and also forcing, you know, Italy and you know, the people of these countries forcing their governments to send ships along, even though that they turned and ran as soon as they saw the Israeli media, like the cowards that they are. That the ships, the naval ships turned and ran, not the flotilla, of course. That Yeah, I mean, this was a really important thing, and I think it continues. You know, I think that they raised the bar the way other groups like Palestine Action and other folks have raised the bar in terms of thinking about what are the ways that we can confront this occupation, the siege on Gaza, etc. Right, and that this, whatever else it did, it caused a moment where countries had to do things that they didn't really want to do in order to kind of deal with this moment, whether it's Italy sending a boat or Spain sending a boat, or, you know, these kind of things. And I think that it's also important to underline the general strikes that have been going on in Italy and how those are probably the thing that led to the pressure that their fascist president said, hey, we got to send a boat along to ease some of this pressure, right? And so that's the thing too about Lara talking about um, you know, revolutionary optimism. and uh and yeah, you mentioned, Lara, the fishermen in Gaza being able to actually fish because the Navy was, you know, too busy taking out the flotilla boats. And so of course uphold all those folks who are still being held by the Zionist prisoners and prisons, and I've heard of the torture that many of them are also enduring. And you know, may their sacrifices also be ones that we uphold and not be in vain as well. um to be angry is to not to not be angry is to be complicit. I think that, yeah, the anger, you know, another comment is affect is a life force, like how June Jordan says love is a life force. Yeah, so, you know, hold on to your anger. And, you know, somebody said also that shame can be, you know, productive. It can also be demobilizing. And that's kind of what you were saying at the end of your comments there, Lara, too, is just like it can be, but it doesn't have to be, right? And so how do we make sure that as we're feeling these emotions that we do feel the full force of them, but then we, you know, say, okay, well, what am I going to do productively with this emotion, as opposed to just like wallow and, you know, do my self-care all by myself without others in a non-revolutionary fashion. All right, I'm going to wrap us up there. Thank you so much again for this conversation. Hopefully this will not be the last time that we can have the two of you in conversation with each other, because I think this was really beautiful today, what both of you shared. And yeah, everybody, I mean, remember October 7th for all of the reasons that for all of the reasons that they want us to forget it, right? And forget all the reasons that they want us to remember it, I guess. So yeah, thank you, friends.
Thank you so much to you both.